The night was quiet, the kind of calm that settles over the city just before midnight. Streetlights cast long shadows across the empty road as a black man in his early 40s drove steadily, obeying every rule. His posture was relaxed, hands loose on the steering wheel, his face unreadable but calm. He had driven this road hundreds of times before. Nothing about this night felt unusual until the flashing red and blue lights ignited behind him. He checked his mirrors, slowed down smoothly, and pulled over without hesitation. The engine shut off, window down, hands visible. Every move was deliberate, practiced, not out of fear, but habit. The police cruiser stopped inches behind him. After a moment that felt longer than it should have, the officer stepped out. His walk was aggressive, boots striking the asphalt harder than necessary. His face already carried suspicion, not curiosity. "License and registration," the officer barked before even reaching the window. The driver nodded politely. "Of course, officer," he replied evenly, reaching slowly into the glove compartment and then his wallet, narrating each movement without being asked. Instead of calming the situation, this seemed to irritate the officer. "Why are you nervous?" The officer snapped. "I'm not," the man said calmly. "Just following procedure." The officer leaned closer, flashlight cutting sharply across the man's face, lingering longer than necessary. He scanned the interior of the car, as if expecting to find something illegal by sheer will. "Where are you coming from?" "Work." "What kind of work?" "Federal." The word hung in the air for a brief second. The officer smirked. "Everyone's federal these days," he said dismissively. "Step out of the vehicle." The man paused only for a heartbeat, then complied. He stepped out slowly, hands visible, posture straight. His calmness stood in stark contrast to the officer's rising hostility. As soon as his feet hit the pavement, the officer began a pat-down that was unnecessarily rough. Passersby slowed their cars, sensing tension. The officer's tone grew sharper, more condescending. "You people always think you're above the law," the officer muttered under his breath. The man said nothing. He had learned long ago that silence was sometimes safer than truth in moments like this. The officer claimed the car matched a vague description. Then he said he smelled something suspicious. Then he accused the man of resisting despite the man standing perfectly still. Within minutes, backup arrived. Before the man could fully process what was happening, cold metal cuffs snapped around his wrists. Still, he did not raise his voice. He did not argue. He simply looked straight ahead as he was guided toward the cruiser. "You have the right to remain silent," the officer recited mechanically, already convinced of his own authority. As the cruiser door closed, the man exhaled slowly, not in fear, but in disappointment. He knew this stop was never about traffic violations. It was about assumptions. What the officer did not know, what he never bothered to verify, was that this calm, silent man understood the law far better than he did, and that this night was only the beginning. The police station was brightly lit, but the light felt cold, sterile, and unforgiving. The calm of the open road was gone, replaced by the sharp echo of footsteps and the constant hum of fluorescent bulbs. The man was led inside, his hands still cuffed behind his back, posture straight, expression controlled. Officers glanced at him briefly, then looked away, already making assumptions without a word exchanged. At the front desk, the arresting officer began narrating his version of events. His tone was confident, almost rehearsed. Driver was uncooperative, suspicious behavior, possible interference, he said, typing rapidly into the system. The man listened quietly. Each word was inaccurate, but he said nothing. He had learned that early reactions often decided the tone of everything that followed. He chose patience over protest. An officer removed the cuffs and gestured toward a bench. "Sit." He complied. Around him, the station buzzed with activity phones ringing, Radios crackling, officers laughing softly over coffee. For them, this was routine. For him, it was a familiar injustice unfolding in a new location. A fingerprint technician approached, barely making eye contact. Ink pressed against his fingers one by one. The process was mechanical, impersonal. His name was entered into the system, followed by a pause. "Date of birth?" the technician asked. He answered calmly. The technician frowned slightly, then continued. Next came the mugshot. He stood against the wall, neutral expression, eyes steady. The camera flashed. In that moment he felt the weight of generations before him, men who had stood in similar positions, accused before being understood. The arresting officer returned, holding a clipboard. "You're being charged with obstruction and resisting," he said. "I didn't resist," the man replied quietly. The officer leaned in, voice low. "You should have thought about that before acting suspicious." There it was again, that word. Suspicious, vague, convenient. The man took a breath. "May I make a phone call?" The officer hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. One call. He was led to a phone mounted on the wall. As he lifted the receiver, his expression didn't change, but his tone did precise, professional. "Yes, this is Judge." He paused, glancing toward the officer nearby, then continued calmly. "I've been detained. I'll need representation immediately." The officer's laughter cut through the room. "Judge? That's a new one." The man hung up without responding. He was escorted to a holding cell, a small, concrete room with a metal bench. The door clanged shut behind him. Alone at last, he sat down slowly and closed his eyes. He didn't panic. He didn't fear the process. What troubled him was how easily the truth had been ignored. Minutes passed. Then an hour. Outside the cell, the arresting officer joked with colleagues, confident the night would end like countless others with paperwork and no consequences. But somewhere beyond the walls of that station, calls were being returned. Records were being pulled. Names were being checked. And a quiet shift had already begun. Because the system the officer thought he controlled was now looking back at him with clarity. The holding cell was silent except for the distant buzz of the station. Judge Marcus Reed sat upright on the metal bench, hands folded, breathing slow and measured. He had spent decades in courtrooms, listening to chaos, lies, desperation. Silence, he knew, was often the loudest phase before truth surfaced. Outside the cell, the mood was casual. Officer Daniels leaned against a desk, scrolling on his phone, confidence untouched. To him, this arrest was already finished. Another black man, acting suspicious, another report filed, another shift nearing its end. Then the phone rang. The desk sergeant glanced at the caller ID and frowned. He answered, listened for a few seconds, then straightened. "Yes, sir." Understood. He hung up slowly and looked around the room. "Daniels. Who did you bring in?" Daniels smirked. "Just some guy trying to act smart. Claimed he's a judge." The sergeant didn't laugh. "Full name," he said. Daniels rolled his eyes. "Marcus Reed." The room shifted. The sergeant typed rapidly into the terminal. His jaw tightened as the screen loaded. He clicked again, then once more, as if hoping the information would change. It didn't. He stood up. "Daniels, come here. Now." The confidence drained from Daniels' face as he approached. The sergeant turned the monitor slightly so only Daniels could see it. Federal Judicial Directory. Honorable Marcus A. Reed, United States District Judge. Daniels swallowed. That can't be right." The sergeant's voice was low but sharp. "You arrested a sitting federal judge." Across the room, laughter died instantly. Officers stopped mid-conversation. Every ear was listening now. "But he didn't say," Daniel stammered. "He asked for a phone call." The sergeant cut in. "You mocked him." The sergeant grabbed the radio. "Lieutenant, we have a situation." Within minutes, the atmosphere changed from casual to controlled panic. Supervisors appeared. Doors opened and closed. Voices dropped to whispers. Someone unlocked the holding cell. Judge Reed looked up as the door opened. His expression was calm, unreadable. "Judge Reed," the sergeant said, clearing his throat. "We need to speak with you." Reed stood slowly. Of course. He was escorted, not pushed this time, into a private office. A lieutenant entered moments later, face tight with concern. "Judge Reed," he began, "there's been a serious misunderstanding." Reed met his eyes. "No," he said evenly. "There's been a serious abuse of authority." The lieutenant nodded, knowing there was no argument to make. "Your charges are being dropped immediately." "I assumed they would be," Reed replied. Outside the office, Daniels stood frozen. Every step of the arrest replayed in his mind the tone, the assumptions, the lies he'd written into the report. A clerk hurried in with paperwork. Another officer whispered, "Internal Affairs has been notified." Daniel's heart sank. Judge Reed adjusted his jacket. "I will be leaving now," he said. "But this will not end here." As he walked out of the station, free and composed, the weight of consequences settled behind him. The badge that once protected Daniels now felt very thin, and the system that had ignored Judge Reed's voice was about to hear it loudly, publicly, and under oath. 2 weeks later, courtroom 7B was packed. The air carried that familiar tension that always followed cases involving police misconduct. Reporters filled the back rows, notebooks ready. Lawyers whispered to their clients. Uniformed officers sat stiffly, eyes forward, trying not to draw attention. Officer Daniel Price sat at the defense table in his pressed uniform, jaw tight. His lawyer had told him this was routine. A minor false arrest claim, paperwork issues, nothing more. Daniel clung to that reassurance like a lifeline. The bailiff's voice cut through the room. "All rise." Everyone stood. When the judge entered, Daniel rose slowly, still adjusting his cuff, barely looking up. It was habit. Judges came and went. Faces blurred together after a while. "Be seated," the judge said. Daniel Zet then froze. The voice. He looked up. His stomach dropped. Behind the bench sat Marcus Reed, not in handcuffs, not calm and silent in a holding cell, but robed, elevated, in full command of the courtroom. The blood drained from Daniel's face. Judge Reed looked out over the room, his expression neutral, professional. If he recognized Daniel, he gave no sign. That alone was terrifying. "This court is now in session," Reed said. "We are here to address the matter of unlawful arrest, falsified police reports, and abuse of authority." Daniel's lawyer shifted uncomfortably. Reed continued, his tone steady. "The plaintiff alleges he was detained without probable cause, denied basic rights, and subjected to fabricated charges." Daniel's hands trembled beneath the table. The prosecutor stood. "Your Honor, the plaintiff is present." Reed nodded. "I am aware." A murmur rippled through the courtroom as realization spread. Whispers turned into shocked expressions. Cameras clicked. Someone in the back audibly gasped. Daniel's lawyer leaned in close. "We didn't know," he whispered urgently. "I swear we didn't know." Judge Reed's gaze finally landed on Daniel. "Officer Price," he said calmly. "Do you recognize me?" Daniel tried to speak. Nothing came out. "Yes or no?" Reed pressed. "Yes," Daniel croaked. "From where?" "The holding cell," Daniel admitted. Voice barely audible. Reed nodded once. "For the record, this court acknowledges that the arresting officer now confirms the identity of the individual he falsely detained." The prosecutor stood again. "Your Honor, we would like to submit dashcam footage, bodycam footage, and the arrest report into evidence." "Granted," Reed replied. The screen flickered to life. The courtroom watched in silence as Daniel's own voice echoed through the speakers, mocking, dismissive, aggressive. The footage showed Reed calmly asking questions, requesting a phone call, stating his rights. Each lie in the written report unraveled in real time. Daniel stared straight ahead, sweat forming at his temples. Judge Reed turned off the monitor. "This court has seen enough," he said. "The charges against the plaintiff are dismissed in full. A pause. And this court orders an immediate referral to Internal Affairs and the District Attorney for criminal review of Officer Daniel Price's conduct." The gavel struck. For Daniel, the sound was final. The man he had humiliated in silence now controlled the room, and the consequences were just beginning. The courtroom emptied slower than usual. No one rushed for the doors. Conversations stayed hushed, heavy, like the room itself was holding its breath. Officer Daniel Price remained seated long after the judge had left the bench. His lawyer whispered something about appeals, procedure, damage control, but the words slid past him without meaning. All Daniel could hear was the echo of his own voice from the playback. Calm lies turned into permanent record. Outside, cameras waited. By the time Daniel stepped onto the courthouse steps, microphones were already pointed at his face. Reporters shouted questions over one another. "Officer Price, did you know the man you arrested was a federal judge? Were you trained to fabricate reports? Is this part of a pattern of racial profiling in your department?" "Lou." Daniel said nothing. He couldn't. His lawyer pushed through the crowd, repeating, "No comment." But the damage was already done. Silence didn't protect him anymore. It incriminated him. Back at the precinct, the mood had changed. Conversation stopped when Daniel walked in. Officers who used to joke with him suddenly found reasons to look busy. His supervisor, Captain Harris, stood outside his office, arms crossed, expression tight. "Badge and weapon," Harris said flatly. Daniel hesitated. "Captain, this is being blown out of proportion." "Badge, weapon, now." Daniel complied. The metal felt heavier than it ever had before. Harris placed both items into an evidence envelope, sealed it, and handed Daniel a suspension notice. "Administrative leave," Harris said. "Effective immediately. Internal Affairs will be contacting you." "For how long?" Daniel asked. Harris met his eyes. "That depends on how deep this goes." Daniel's locker felt unfamiliar as he cleared it out. Every sound, the clang of metal, the squeak of hinges felt louder than it should have. He noticed things he'd ignored for years. A training poster about ethics, a flyer about community trust, words that now read like accusations. Meanwhile, across town, Judge Marcus Reed sat in a quiet office. No cameras, no noise. A federal investigator reviewed files across the table from him, body cam timestamps, audio transcripts, complaint histories. "This wasn't isolated," the investigator said. "Price has multiple prior complaints. Dismissed, lost, ignored." Reed nodded. "Patterns survive when silence protects them." By the end of the week, the district attorney's office announced a formal inquiry. Internal Affairs opened a parallel investigation. The department issued a carefully worded statement about accountability and due process. Daniel watched it all unfold from his apartment, news playing non-stop. Friends stopped calling. Texts went unanswered. His name trended online, always paired with words like corrupt, racist, abuse of power. Then came the letter. A formal notice from the DA. Potential charges under civil rights violations, falsification of records, and unlawful detention. Each line felt like another door slamming shut. Daniel folded the paper carefully, hands shaking. For years he'd believed authority was armor, that the uniform protected him, that reports mattered more than truth. Now, Stripped of the badge, surrounded by evidence, he faced a reality he'd never prepared for. The system he manipulated was finally looking back, and it wasn't blinking. Internal affairs moved faster than Daniel Price expected. Within days, investigators pulled his entire service record, every stop, every arrest, every report he had written over the past 7 years. What once felt like routine paperwork now became evidence. Patterns emerged quickly. Stops involving black civilians appeared disproportionately often. Charges were frequently vague: disorderly conduct, resisting without violence, suspicious behavior, the kind of language that could mean anything and hide everything. Daniel was called in for questioning. The IA interview room felt colder than a jail cell. No badge on the table, no casual tone. 2 investigators sat across from him, calm, methodical, already informed. They didn't raise their voices. They didn't accuse him outright. They let silence do the work. "Walk us through the arrest," one investigator said. Daniel repeated his story carefully. He stuck to the report. Claimed the judge, though he still avoided using that word, had been uncooperative. Claimed he felt threatened. Claimed procedure. The second investigator slid a tablet across the table and pressed play. Audio filled the room. Daniel's voice again. Mocking, provoking, manufacturing authority when none was needed. Then, a still image. Bodycam footage showing Judge Marcus Reed standing exactly where Daniel claimed he wasn't. Calm. Hands visible. Non-threatening. Daniel swallowed. "You want to amend your statement?" the investigator asked. Daniel didn't answer. At the same time, federal oversight stepped in. Because the victim was a federal judge, the case crossed jurisdictions. That changed everything. Subpoenas were issued. Dispatch logs were pulled. Patrol car GPS data contradicted Daniel's timeline. Even fellow officers were questioned, some reluctantly, some eagerly, sensing the tide had turned. One officer broke first. He admitted Daniel had bragged about teaching people lessons. Another recalled being told to back the report no matter what. The blue wall cracked not out of morality, but self-preservation. Across town, Judge Reed testified before an ethics committee not as a victim, but as a witness to a system failure. His words were measured, deliberate. "This was not about me," Reed said. "If it were, this would be simple. This is about how easily power can be abused when accountability is assumed instead of enforced." Public reaction intensified. Community leaders demanded audits. Civil rights groups requested case reviews. Names surfaced. Old complaints resurfaced. Daniel's lawyer advised him to stay quiet, to wait, to hope for procedural errors. But procedure was no longer his shield. At home, Daniel stared at his reflection, struggling to recognize the man looking back. He'd always believed he was in control, that stops ended when he decided they did. Now, timelines, footage, and witnesses dictated the narrative. For the first time in his career, Daniel understood something he'd never considered before. He was no longer the one writing the report, and the truth, once buried, had begun digging its way out with precision, patience, and consequences he could no longer outrun. The department tried to contain the damage, but containment requires cooperation, and cooperation was already slipping. What began as a single arrest had grown into a spotlight, and the spotlight refused to move on. Every meeting, every email, every shift briefing carried the same unspoken tension. Who's next? Captain Harris faced pressure from both sides. City officials wanted answers. Union representatives wanted protection. The media wanted names. Harris ordered a quiet internal review, hoping to show action without inviting chaos. But reviews have a way of uncovering more than intended. Bodycam footage from Daniel Price's previous stops was re-examined. In several cases, Cameras mysteriously malfunctioned at critical moments. In others, footage existed but contradicted reports. A pattern of strategic positioning, missing seconds, and convenient angles emerged too consistent to be coincidence. Internal Affairs circulated a memo requesting officers to voluntarily come forward with concerns related to Officer Price. The wording was neutral. The impact was not. Whispers spread through the locker room. Some officers defended Daniel, claiming he was aggressive but effective. Others stayed silent, afraid that speaking up or staying quiet would mark them either way. A few younger officers, less invested in old loyalties, began submitting statements. They described pressure to mirror Daniel's language in reports, to support stops they hadn't fully witnessed. The shield everyone relied on, the unwritten rule that officers protect their own, started to crack under its own weight. Daniel felt it immediately. Friends stopped responding. Training buddies avoided eye contact. The union rep stopped returning calls as quickly. Protection had limits, and Daniel had crossed into territory where he was no longer an asset, he was a liability. Then came the civil filing. Judge Marcus Reed's legal team submitted a federal civil rights lawsuit, not for damages, but for systemic review. The suit named Daniel Price directly and included language that suggested intent, not error. It referenced prior complaints, statistical patterns, and departmental negligence. That detail mattered. Intent changed consequences. City Council scheduled an emergency session. Community speakers packed the chamber. Stories surfaced similar stops, similar treatment, similar silence afterward. Daniel's name came up again and again, always paired with the same description: calm victims, aggressive authority. At home, Daniel watched the coverage with growing panic. His lawyer shifted strategy, advising him to prepare for separation from the department. Not suspension, separation. Termination. Worse still, criminal referral was now on the table. The union issued a carefully worded statement distancing itself from any officer found to have violated policy or law. Daniel read it twice. The message was clear. You're on your own. Meanwhile, Judge Reed continued his work quietly. He declined interviews. He didn't comment publicly. His restraint spoke louder than outrage ever could. Every filing, every testimony, every motion was precise and unpersonal. That terrified Daniel more than anger, because anger fades. Records don't. By the end of the week, Internal Affairs finalized its preliminary findings. The report concluded there was sufficient evidence to believe Daniel Price had engaged in misconduct, falsified reports, and abused his authority. The shield had failed, and now nothing stood between Daniel and the consequences he'd spent years assuming would never reach him. The criminal referral came quietly, without sirens or announcements. A sealed envelope delivered to Daniel Price's attorney. A single line inside changed everything. The district attorney has accepted the case for prosecution. From that moment on, the situation was no longer administrative. It was criminal. Daniel sat across from his lawyer in a downtown office. Blinds half closed, the city humming outside as if nothing had changed. They're not negotiating, the lawyer said carefully. They believe they can prove intent. Daniel leaned forward. Based on what? A misunderstanding? One arrest? The lawyer slid a thick folder across the desk. Based on this? Inside were transcripts, his words highlighted. Side-by-side comparisons of body cam footage and written reports. Timestamps that didn't match. GPS data placing him in locations he claimed he never stopped. A timeline that dismantled his version piece by piece. They're arguing pattern, the lawyer continued, that this wasn't a mistake, it was behavior. Daniel's mouth went dry. Meanwhile, prosecutors prepared their strategy. This wasn't about winning headlines, it was about airtight evidence. They brought in experts on police procedure, civil rights law, and body cam forensics. Every claim Daniel had made was tested against policy, training manuals, and precedent. None of it favored him. Judge Marcus Reed was formally listed as a key witness, though he needed no testimony to command credibility. His written statement alone carried weight. It described the arrest without emotion, focusing on facts, sequence, and deviation from protocol. It was devastating in its simplicity. At the precinct, officers were instructed to preserve all records related to Daniel Price. Computers were imaged, lockers sealed, supervisors interviewed under oath. The department's attempt at quiet containment officially collapsed. Public trust fell with it. News outlets framed the story not as one bad cop, but as a test of accountability. Commentators debated whether this case would set precedent. Civil rights attorneys watched closely. Daniel felt the walls closing in. He stopped sleeping. Every sound outside his apartment felt like a knock at the door. His phone buzzed, constantly alerts, headlines, legal updates. Friends stopped asking how he was doing. They asked what he planned to do if he went to prison. The arraignment date was set. For the first time in his life, Daniel would stand on the other side of the courtroom not as an officer, not as authority, but as a defendant. And on the morning of that hearing, he would see Judge Marcus Reed again, not across a patrol car hood, not behind handcuffs, but across a courtroom where the rules he once bent would finally apply to him. The case wasn't unraveling anymore. It had unraveled, and there was no way to stitch it back together. The courtroom was full long before the hearing began. Reporters lined the back rows. Legal analysts whispered to one another, and members of the public sat shoulder to shoulder, drawn by the weight of what this case represented. When Daniel Price entered, no one looked away. For years he had controlled rooms like this with a badge and a voice. Today he carried neither. He sat beside his attorney, hands clasped tightly, eyes fixed forward. The judge presiding was not Marcus Reed protocol-demanded distance, but his presence was felt everywhere. The courtroom knew who the case was about. They knew who had been wronged. The prosecutor rose first. She spoke calmly, without drama, letting facts do the damage. She outlined the traffic stop, the fabricated charge, the arrest, and the deliberate misrepresentation of events. Each claim was paired with evidence audio clips, still frames from bodycam footage, time-stamped GPS data. When Daniel's voice played through the speakers, the room grew tense. The tone, the threats, the casual certainty of power. There was no outrage in the room, only recognition. The defense tried to frame it as stress, as misinterpretation, as a single lapse in judgment. They argued procedural ambiguity. They argued fear. They argued experience. The prosecutor countered with pattern. She presented prior stops, prior complaints, statistical analysis showing disproportionate targeting, witness statements from fellow officers. Internal memos Daniel never thought would resurface. Then came the testimony. An internal affairs investigator explained how reports were altered. A bodycam specialist described how footage was intentionally obstructed. A supervising officer admitted under oath that concerns had been raised and ignored. Finally, Judge Marcus Reed's written statement was read into the record. No injure, no accusation, just fact. I complied fully. I was calm. I was arrested without legal basis. The simplicity of it carried more weight than any speech. Daniel stared at the table, jaw clenched. For the first time, he understood the difference between authority and accountability. One disappears the moment it's questioned. The other only grows stronger. The judge, overseeing the hearing, leaned forward. Based on the evidence presented, the court found probable cause on multiple counts: civil rights violations, falsification of records, and abuse of authority. Bail conditions were set. The case would proceed to trial. The gavel struck. It was not loud. It didn't need to be. Outside, Cameras flashed as Daniel was escorted out, not in cuffs, but under supervision. The image traveled fast. A man once feared now looked small, surrounded by rules he could no longer bend. Inside the courthouse, Marcus Reed walked a different hallway, unbothered, composed. He did not look back. He didn't need to. Judgment had begun not with revenge, not with spectacle, but with something Daniel had never learned to respect: the law, applied evenly. The weeks between hearings moved slowly, but the pressure never eased. Daniel Price lived in a suspended state, free in name, trapped in reality. His days revolved around court filings, lawyer meetings, and the constant hum of public scrutiny. Every motion filed by the prosecution tightened the net. Every attempt by the defense to weaken the case collapsed under documentation. The trial date was set. Inside the courtroom, the tone was no longer investigative. It was decisive. This phase was about conclusions, not questions. The prosecution refined its argument into a single, unshakable narrative. This was not an accident, not stress, not miscommunication. It was a conscious abuse of authority. Witnesses returned, sharper and more confident. Officers who had once hesitated now spoke clearly. They described how Daniel shaped reports, how he framed stops, how he treated compliance as defiance when it suited him. Training officers testified that his actions violated protocol at multiple levels. Policy experts explained, line by line, where procedure ended and misconduct began. The defense had little room left. They attempted mitigation instead of denial. Daniel's lawyer emphasized years of service, commendations, the absence of prior convictions. They suggested systemic failures, lack of supervision, cultural issues within the department. Subtly, responsibility shifted away from Daniel himself. The prosecution didn't resist that argument. They embraced it. Yes, the prosecutor said, systems failed, but systems don't arrest people, officers do. That distinction landed heavily. Judge Marcus Reed did not appear in the courtroom, but his presence remained central. His experience, his position, and his restraint reframed the case. If this could happen to a federal judge acting as a private citizen, the implication was unavoidable. It could happen to anyone. That truth echoed through the gallery. When closing arguments ended, the courtroom fell silent. The judge presiding reviewed the evidence without haste. No dramatics, no speeches, just careful consideration. Then the ruling came. The court found Daniel Price guilty on multiple counts: falsification of records, unlawful detention, and violation of civil rights under color of law. The words were precise, measured, and final. Daniel felt the air leave his chest. Sentencing was scheduled for a later date, but the damage was already irreversible. His career was over. His credibility destroyed. The badge he once wore as protection now appeared in evidence photos, symbolizing the very abuse it was meant to prevent. Outside the courtroom, reactions varied. Some called it justice, others called it overdue. For many, it was simply proof. Proof that authority, when documented, could be challenged. Daniel was escorted out quietly. No applause. No shouting. Just the weight of consequence settling in. For the first time since that traffic stop, there was no report left to write, no version left to shape. Only the truth recorded, reviewed, and finally enforced. The sentencing hearing was brief and procedural. There were no raised voices, no dramatic pauses, no moral lectures. The judge read the ruling with precision, outlining the consequences clearly: incarceration, permanent termination from the police department, revocation of law enforcement certification, and a federal record that could not be erased or negotiated away. The law did not acknowledge Daniel Price's years of service or former authority. It addressed only the violations. Daniel stood still as the sentence was delivered. He did not argue. He did not react. Whatever defenses he once believed in had already failed. When the gavel came down, it did not feel sudden, it felt inevitable. He was escorted from the courtroom through a private corridor. No cameras followed, no reporters waited. The attention had moved on, but the consequences had not. By the end of the day, his name was officially removed from the department roster. His badge number was retired. His personnel file was sealed, marked permanently by misconduct findings. The department moved quickly to protect itself. An oversight panel was formed to review arrests and reports tied to Daniel Price. Dozens of cases were flagged. Some were dismissed outright. Others were reopened, forcing prosecutors to confront how much of their evidence had relied solely on Daniel's written narratives. Letters were sent to individuals previously arrested by him, informing them of potential misconduct in their cases. For some recipients, the letters brought relief. For others, they reopened years of unresolved damage, lost jobs, damaged reputations, strained families. Accountability, when delayed, still carries cost. Policy reforms followed quietly. Body camera audits became mandatory rather than discretionary. Report language was standardized to reduce subjective interpretation. Supervisors were required to review stop footage weekly instead of relying on written summaries. The department framed these changes as modernization, but internally, everyone understood the catalyst. Judge Marcus Reed continued his work without comment. He refused interviews, declined public statements, and returned to the bench as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. His silence was intentional. The case had never been about exposure, it had been about correction. Nationally, the case circulated through legal training programs and civil rights seminars. It became a reference point not as an anomaly, but as an example of how unchecked authority can be dismantled by documentation and process. Inside the correctional system, Daniel entered a world governed by rules he no longer interpreted. He was processed, assigned, monitored. His former status offered no protection. Compliance was expected, not rewarded. At night, he replayed the traffic stop, the calm driver, the quiet defiance he had mistaken for weakness. What once felt routine now felt irreversible. The system had not turned against him. It had simply stopped protecting him. If you want Chapter 12, expanded next, or need tone adjustments, more brutal, more cinematic, or more documentary style, just say the word. Time moved forward, indifferent to what it left behind. For Daniel Price, days blended into one another, inside concrete walls governed by routine and rules he could not bend. The authority he once carried had dissolved completely. There were no reports to write, no decisions to control outcomes. Only compliance, observation, and consequence. His name no longer carried weight. Inside the facility, Daniel learned restraint the hard way. He followed instructions carefully, avoided attention, spoke only when necessary. He was no longer feared, no longer deferred to. He was processed like everyone else counted, documented, monitored. The structure he once enforced now defined his existence. Beyond the walls, the impact of his actions continued quietly. Courtrooms across the district reviewed cases tied to his badge number. Judges scrutinized reports with a new level of skepticism. Prosecutors adjusted how they evaluated officer testimony. Defense attorneys requested bodycam footage as standard practice, no longer trusting narrative alone. One man's exposure altered how evidence was treated. Judge Marcus Reed remained exactly where he had always been, on the bench. He did not reference the case in rulings. He did not acknowledge it publicly. But his presence carried new weight. Lawyers noticed how carefully he examined police testimony, how he paused when timelines didn't align, how he requested footage instead of summaries. The law had not changed, its enforcement had. In the community, the case became a point of quiet recognition, not a celebration, not closure, but awareness. People spoke about documentation, about patience, about knowing when silence was strategic, not submissive. The story circulated not as rumor, but as record. Daniel's appeals failed quickly. The evidence was too complete, the documentation too precise. There were no procedural errors to exploit, no ambiguities to stretch. His case had been built the same way he once built, others carefully, confidently, and without mercy. Eventually, his name stopped appearing in news articles. Public attention moved on, as it always does. But in training rooms, legal briefings, and internal audits, it remained. Not as a headline, but as a lesson. Inside his cell, Daniel understood something he had never grasped while wearing the uniform. Power does not come from control, it comes from accountability. And accountability does not require force. It requires record. Judge Reed never spoke to him again. He didn't need to. The outcome had never depended on confrontation. It had depended on patience, evidence, and process. The traffic stop that began as a routine exercise of authority ended as a permanent entry in history, not because it was dramatic, but because it was documented. And long after sentences were served and names were forgotten, the record remained. Unchanged. Unavoidable. Final.